Hi, welcome back to another episode of Teddy Talk. I'm joined with Dr. Ramirez, who is a faculty in residence and also currently a faculty member at the Chicanx Studies Department. I want to give a moment to allow him to introduce himself.
Well, thank you, Teddy. So once again, this is Dr. Johnny Carlos Ramirez. In a lot of my work as a Chicanx Studies professor, I really like to, I guess, acknowledge myself and how I approach like community spaces like the classroom and community. So I've worked with young people and students for a lot of years. So sometimes, students will call me Profe Johnny, sometimes like in the community that they'll call me Dr. Johnny Rocket, right? So, but again, my name is Johnny Carlos Ramirez. I'm a third generation Chicano Mexican-American here, and I'm a newly appointed assistant professor in the Chicano Studies Department here at SJSU.
Well, welcome to SJSU and welcome joining with us today. Let's start with your journey becoming a professor. Tell us a little bit about that. Why did you become a professor?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, my journey to become a professor was really, I think, kind of grounded in my experiences with my education, with schooling. I grew up with a lot of barriers, I would say. Like, I was born to teen parents. My mom was like 15 years old when she had me, and my pops was like 18. So they were teen parents, and it was kind of a situation where it was them against the world, and we're going to raise this family and everything. So growing up in that environment as a little kid, I kind of just thought, this is just my family, my parents, things were very normalized. But as I got older, I recognized that I was growing up in low income environments, struggling with poverty conditions and in some of those neighborhoods growing up. And this was the time of during the 80s. A lot of my childhood was during the 80s. And what we now know during the 80s was increasing in gang violence, increasing gun violence. Unfortunately, what scholars now call the crack economy, the influx of drugs in communities of color. So, I remember growing up as a kid, kind of seeing things in my neighborhood, being exposed to, again, those different struggles and barriers in terms of violence and poverty. But for me, I don't remember ever really having a struggle with my education. That came a little bit later when I started going into middle school and my first year in high school. And I think at that time, it was more of a situation where now what I know about in my research in terms of adolescent development is that I was at a point where I started to kind of recognize my role in the world. And I started reading the world around me, my family life conditions. My pops had passed away. So I was being raised by a single mom with two younger siblings. I was the oldest. So I just felt like a lot of these pressures and adult roles that were kind of put on me, and not having an outlet, not having a mentor, not having a space in my education or a teacher that I could come to for that kind of guidance and support. Early on, I felt like I carried a lot of anger. I carried a lot of these stressors with me, and not having an outlet or a place to be able to share out what those feelings are and get some guidance and mentorship. So, as a middle school kid, got in a lot of fights, struggled with anger management, those kind of things. That kind of led into my ninth grade year when I was 14 years old, where I got pushed out of high school. And I say that I got pushed out because, again, I was this young person that was kind of struggling, that was looking for someone to kind of really, make a connection with me, to kind of humanize my struggle. But all that I was getting from counselors and teachers was I was being seen as the problem. And I never forget this one time of having this meeting with this quote unquote gang intervention worker that was telling my mom that I was there at their high school trying to basically recruit and start a gang, and that I was basically, causing harm to the campus. And I remember, my mom being really strong and letting them know, no, our family, our community's been impacted by gangs and by that kind of violence, and that's not my son. I know my son's struggling, but that's not him. And for that time in particular was really looking for someone to just be like, hey, what's going on? What's going on in your life? What's going on at home? Why are you feeling so angry? Why are you feeling so hurt? What's going on? So for me, I think that was a part where the school system, I think at some point was pretty much failing me, not wanting to take an extra step to figure out where I was at and my needs. But fast forward a little bit, things changed in my home life. My mom remarried, shout outs to my stepdad, really good man. We start to put this blended family together, and I get exposed to these college students. I went back to school at a continuation school, and there I met these two college students that were working with a cultural student organization called MECHA, Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano Chicana de Aztlán. And in this student group, they were looking to work with high school youth to try to encourage them to pursue college, but then also to get them involved on their campus in the community, to kind of get them involved in what I now know as activism and organizing, right? And expressing student power and representation, right? And for me, it was like the first time that I ever saw anyone that looked like me, that dressed like me, that talked like me, that was even connected to a college. And when we got invited to a conference there, the first time I walked onto a college campus, shout outs to Cal State Fullerton that was holding the National Mecha Conference, I rolled in and it was kind of like a mind blow to walk into an auditorium type stadium classroom with like over 300 students and hearing these speakers that talked about history and culture. And they talked about this thing called El Movimiento, which translated loosely is the movement of the civil rights movement of Mexican Americans that during the 60s and 70s walked out and expressed their demands to have an education that met their needs. And I think for me, it was just like this big moment where I felt like, hey, this is speaking to my life. This is giving me almost like this deepened sense of purpose. Now I want to learn everything more I can learn about, what this identity is of being a Chicano and what is Chicano history and Chicano culture. So I finished up high school and I went to community college and I took my first Chicano studies class. And shout outs to, one of my first mentors, Professor Enrique Lopez. And again, now when in reflection, when I think about it as an education scholar, again, only maybe a handful of male teachers of color in my life too. So I think that was kind of like a connection and an inspiring thing to see. Yeah, he really kind of took me under his wing and was just like, let's meet after class. Here, I've got this book for you. I'm taking some of the students out to lunch. Come on, let's go. He was a father too. So he had two young boys that were in Little League. And sometimes he would say, hey, I'm coaching this Little League game. If you all want to come down after class, come to Pomona, come spend time with my family and watch my boys play. And it was like just this whole, I wanted to be like my mentor. It was like, I really felt that like for me, it was Chicano studies in particular, I think was giving me a space to develop a lens and a language to articulate some of those struggles that I was going through as a young person. And I think one of the biggest ones was just reflecting on my family's kind of trajectory. In my introduction, I had mentioned that I'm third generation. That means that Mexican American, that means that my grandparents were actually born here in the US in the 20s and 30s. And when I, started to do my history homework, you really started to see the struggles that they had in schooling. There was these Americanization programs that practiced corporal punishment, that used to paddle and used to spank, Mexican children for speaking Spanish in the classroom. And that kind of trauma then leads to me being third generation where I'm not fully bilingual, Spanish speaker. So I've always been on that learning curve of trying to work on my Spanish. Both on my grandparents' side were migrant farm workers. So both of them started as children into their adult lives working in the fields. So that kind of connected to, again, the United Farm Workers movement and that fight for economic justice in the fields. And then more later in my parents' generation of them being second generation and just looking at the impacts and the rise of gang culture in the Chicano Latino community too, and knowing that they were being impacted as young people. They were struggling with an education system. They were struggling, and both of my parents' homes were struggling with trauma, that were like kind of fueled by alcoholism, divorce, those kind of things. So I think for me, what it did is it kind of gave a humanizing lens to understand that these impacts that are stressors that I'm trying to deal with and negotiate, they're actually rooted in systems of oppression, of inequality that, from my grandparents on down and even my ancestors in general have been very resilient, have been able to move forward, but they've been able to do so under some very heavy conditions. And those conditions, a lot of those kind of behaviors we now know is generational trauma. So I think what Chicano studies did for me as a young person was kind of give me, again, that like ability to kind of understand that and ability to make sense of it. But that first entryway was my Chicano studies professor. So I was sitting there, I was 19 years old, and I was like, well, what do I want to be when I, grow up? Or what do I want to do with this whole school thing? And it was, I want to be a profe. I want to be just like him. And that's where it started. But then, of course, through my journey, transfer to UCLA and going away, I was like, well, hey, I wouldn't mind being a professor here at the big university. I wouldn't mind getting a PhD, and that stuff kind of came along the way. But yeah, I think my first initial kind of passion to find this profession and to find this role was it being modeled by my first Chicano studies professor in community college.
Thank you so much for that, especially talking about your journey. There's a lot of important touch points that you mentioned, from developing a humanized lens in terms of your growth from a child into an adult, the idea of being instilled with activism and the history of resiliency. There's some couple topics I want to to continue along that piece, you mentioned, the importance of your professor that helped mentor and nurture you and give you that opportunity in your community college early years of your education. How do we help or find those opportunities? And I think you bring in an important lens too, is a lot of times we think about just our first year students that come in from straight out of high school. But what about our transfer students too? How do you become successful here in college, and maybe not just at San Jose State, but how do we be successful students?
Yeah, thank you, Teddy. I really think about, again, kind of like drawing from a lot of my youth work and a bit of my research, right? They talk about these moments called transitions. And I think, one thing that I would say, whether you're an incoming student first year right out of high school or a transfer student, that being kind of like able to transition right into university life or to being this college student is definitely a process. One of the first things that I think would be important to acknowledge is that, it is something that isn't just like where you kind of step into a university campus and think, oh, okay, now I know exactly what I need to do. I know what I need to do to be successful. I know where all the resources are at, and, I'm going to be set. That's probably farthest from the truth of really what that transition looks like into the university. So in education and part of my research too, we talk about this concept called the hidden curriculum. And basically kind of overall, the hidden curriculum at its core is that coming into the university, or when you come into this schooling environment, that there's actually like a process that's going on here, right? That you just don't walk into a university or into a schooling environment and that there's not really kind of systems and processes in play. There actually is. And that there's this learning curve that needs to happen when you get to the university that can help you negotiate and navigate those different kind of like environments or processes to get you to be successful. So right off the top, it's more of an understanding that, hey, I'm going to the university and it's college, but there's a structure going on here. There's a process happening. And how can I learn this process so that I can figure ways to be strategic and being successful? And I think for me, one of the things about the hidden curriculum that I think is really key in that transition is for students that are transitioning in early on is to try to identify mentors. I say that only, or mentors and femtors, because I think that for me, I feel that's been a common denominator or been part of a foundational block of who I am as a student and then now as a scholar, was being a product of mentorship. That nobody, even if they want to believe this, does it by themselves. That there is folks that are here at the university that have this institutional knowledge, they have resources, they have networks. And once you're able to kind of build in connections to that and get connected to that knowledge resource, that these folks will want to be there to kind of guide you or offer you perspectives, right, to consider on your journey here. For me, I think I was really fortunate and blessed in many ways to identify mentors when I was at the community college with my Chicano studies professor and one of my counselors, who was also an advisor to our student group too. So I would think like identifying that. Now that's a process as well, setting up office hours, taking that brave step and that brave space of wanting to meet with your professors. But I would say that for the most part, if you're in a class and you really appreciate how the professor opens up that class or does a great lecture that really kind of intrigued you and got you thinking, take those notes down. Talk about what you observed and how it kind of like left an impression with you. And those are the first things that you can go to in office hours to talk to them about. You can introduce yourself, let them know, maybe the region or the area that you grew up, whether you're local or you moved here for school, and then just be like, at this lecture, when you said this, it really spoke to me, and kind of share. And I think these professors would be so open, they'll help you create that conversation, right? I think the first thing is really at some point for students to take that kind of initiative to start that process, right? And then there's folks like us that I think come in ethnic studies and everything, where we're a lot of first steppers. So, we might just be walking through the halls and we might just say, hey, how you doing? We might just start those kind of relationship building techniques early on. But I think that's something in terms of like kind of navigating that hidden curriculum is definitely early on. I'm talking, if not the first semester, second semester, start to build your circle, start to build your mentors. And they could be in student groups. They could be the advisors of those student groups. I know that there's student retention centers and support centers like the Chicanx, Latinx, El Centro here on campus. And Lily and Lisa, the director and staff coordinators that are there, are amazing. And they might be a good way to like connect. And then also potentially even connecting and meeting students that are third and fourth year, that are more senior students that have been here for a while. And, and it might start there, but I think it's really kind of breaking this mold that as much as a university kind of perpetuates this idea of meritocracy, that everybody does it by themselves and everybody pulls it up by their bootstraps and there's a competition going on. I think there's another way to really look at the university. You can look at it as this is a brand new community and let's see what I can do here to start to build relationships and contacts with folks that then could be part of my support system as I move forward here. But I think it's a mindset. You have to, especially I'm thinking of a lot of our students that are coming right out of high school. It might be the first time that you're going to take that step to send that email and to have that one-on-one meeting, and I've always been comfortable too. Some students need to take a friend sometimes. Some students need to take an advocate. That's fine too. I think you have to really have a growth mindset to really show yourself grace, but also be brave in the sense of wanting to take some of these steps forward, because I think there's plenty of folks here in our SJSU community that would love to meet you where you're at and walk with you through a process to build you up so you could find your voice or so that you could maybe find your major, or potentially even find like that career path that you might want to pursue.
I like that you give us a good foothold in how to build that community of success. But sometimes things don't always go the right way. We sometimes fail and we crash and burn, whatever you want to say. And you mentioned a little bit early on about resiliency that's been grown within your own family history. How do you build resiliency if sometimes as I'm trying to build that circle, I'm trying to network and things just don't go my way? How do you build that framework?
It can get bumpy. In no way do we ever want to romanticize that, you're going to just send one email and then you're going to find the right professor and it's all going to like click. Like, no, it's definitely a journey, I think, in many times to get to that place where you're actually able to build those relationships. But I think I would first off by kind of acknowledging more of my recent studies too, and looking at indigenous-centered approaches and ways of seeing the world that offer healing. So I would say this, one way to kind of think about building your resiliency is thinking about this kind of, I guess, like framing of how to see the world, which is movement is medicine. So if you're kind of going through and having a bumpy, difficult time, maybe you're even dealing with stuff on the personal side, emotionally, maybe things that are starting to kind of stir up for you, you're going to need support that you don't feel potentially comfortable just to approach anyone about it, right? I would think even in those heavy situations, taking one action step forward, even at the micro level, will be part of helping you to build that resiliency and keep you moving forward in a good way. So I guess an example would be if that heaviness was kind of going on and you are here on campus and you're starting to build a relationship with a friend and you really feel like there's things that you're carrying that you want to talk to your friend or share with your friend, you could send a text message saying, hey, I'd really like to talk. Do you think that we can start talking here on the text? There's some things that I'm going through, and start the conversation on text. And then maybe after the text say, hey, well then could we meet up? Do you think we can meet for lunch? Do you think we can talk? I'm talking at things at the micro level there, to actually saying, hey, there's a lot going on. Let's go to CAPS. Let's go to counseling services, right? Let's go check in. And I've never done this before, but I feel like there's a lot of heaviness that I'm carrying right now. And I want to be able to get some support, right? And that I think the hardest thing sometimes in resiliency, and this is probably, coming from a lot of my story and being the oldest and kind of being this like where you've got to be an example and, kind of even coming from as a youth worker too, kind of being that mentor, is this feeling that sometimes you carry everything on your shoulders. And then it's like, but then who takes care of the mentor? Who takes care of the person that's in a position that's supporting others? So I would encourage for students or folks in that situation is making that very intentional to say, hey, you deserve someone to be there for you too. Whether it's your peers, whether it's your support system, whether it's like CAP services, whether it's like going into some of the support and retention centers and talking to the coordinators there. But I think it's about kind of, reaching out even when it's very difficult. And, I've worked with students where it's gotten rough to where they're just like, I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready to kind of bring somebody. I'm not ready to kind of share this stuff. So then I would be like, well, are you ready to journal? Can I buy you a journal? Can you begin to share out in your journal so that, you know, and what we know a lot about this is all these strategies are ways to be able to really kind of offer a release so that these stressors don't build up, so that then they end up, you know, causing harm, whether it's addictive behaviors or whether it's, you know, self-harm, right? And that can happen in many ways. You know, I think for me, you know, there's no easy answer with it. And there actually kind of isn't a playbook in terms of that resiliency. But I think for me, I would encourage any student to say that you're not alone. And a lot of that really resiliency comes from building communities or finding your supporters. And I think that, again, it kind of goes back to potentially being in that brave space to let somebody in or to allow yourself to reach out. And it's a learning process and it's a journey. It can get bumpy, but I would encourage anyone that's really at a point that's like, you know, really struggling with the resiliency and motivation and why am I here? And maybe college isn't for me and everything. It's like, no, we got to get you talking to folks. We got to get you to get exposed to different perspectives and different stories, because there isn't one way to be here at the university. There's plenty of identities, of stories, of lifestyles, of perspectives that have been able not just to succeed here, but to thrive here. So, you know, I think it's about finding kind of like that connection that speaks to you so that you can be able to get some of that support and some of that perspective to then help you move forward.
You know, as you're talking about all these different topics, from the hidden curriculum to finding mentorships and finding that guide to help you navigate through that, if students find connection with some of the things that you've been talking about, how do students or how do people find you? How do they get a hold of you, and how can they get that conversation started?
Yeah, no, thank you, Teddy. You know, I think for me, being a first year professor, I've been learning and I've been trying to be very intentional about finding ways to connect with my students. I think one thing I'm learning about this profession of being a professor, full-time, you know, tenure track professor, is I'm being called to do a variety of different things. I've been called to be, you know, to teach in the classroom, to do curriculum development, to mentor students in the classroom. I'm also called to do research. So I do community engaged research with youth programs that work with youth that the system wants to label high risk or at risk, to develop intervention strategies and programs for them. And then I'm called to do service. And this year in particular, I'm going to be working with El Centro to kind of develop a Latinx male kind of healing circle program. It's a pilot program, but it's in the works in terms of like really addressing the low retention rate for men of color on campus. So to say all that broadly, I've got these different projects, but I think what I've been really good at is sharing with my students what my capacities are and what access looks like. So right off the top, I would be like, email is like amazing. It's number one. I'm really good at like documenting my emails, responding back. Give me a second. Let me look on that and I'll come back to you. And I'm always have my trusty notepad right here to kind of track on where my students are at in terms of follow-ups. The second way I think of like building with me in particular would be working with my department here, with our program coordinator, with Arlinda Yanes, that also kind of looks at my schedule and then is actually able to set up times during my office hours, right? And I'm really good about office hours by appointment. So my thing would be send an email. We'll do a bit of e-introduction, and then we'll set up a time, and then we can meet via Zoom, we can meet in person, or we can meet via phone. And then I have a landline here as well. So I think those are kind of the beginning spaces, but I think too, you know, I've also worked with folks that have actually like referred. So when I've gotten like messages from other faculty colleagues or from El Centro, hey, this one student I think would be great for you to meet with and everything, I'd be like, okay, that's cool. Just set up the time. It works with me. I'll be there, to kind of maybe even alleviate that. How could I say a bit of that uneasy feeling or awkwardness of like, hey, I'm just going to show up and be like, I just watched your video, you know. But again, I think those would be the ways that I'm able to connect with students. And I think there's an art form to that. So I'm hoping to figure out that there's probably even more ways that I haven't even really tapped into, like with social media, like using Insta and like all that kind of things that little by little I want to build up to and kind of have in my mentoring toolbox.
Awesome. We will make sure we include your email in the information that we would send out talking about this. But before we let you go, I do want to thank you for taking the time with us, talking so much about your experience, your history, but I think it's also getting that perspective in terms of it is important building relationships, but it's also that resiliency is making that first whether it's baby step. Forward progress is important, and building that community. And thank you so much for taking the time, and hope to talk to you soon. And we'd love to find more time if we can talk more about some of the research that you're doing, but also these topics. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Teddy. Sounds good. Take care.